This is Knepp Estate in southern England, a pioneering and really influential rewilding project. 25 years ago, this was a failing industrial farm. They couldn't get the crops to grow, it was losing money. They let nature take over again. And since then, it has become an absolute paradise, a really interesting scientific laboratory and a beacon of hope that biodiversity can bounce back. Isabella wrote this really brilliant book called Rewilding. I'm off to a castle to meet her and ask her when was the moment that she believed that this project really was going to be a success.
Well, it was very early on in the project, I think. It was when we heard all those insects coming back, something we didn't even know we were missing when we were farming. And that was a thrill. I mean, having never really walked through a meadow and kicked up common blue butterflies, was just really intoxicating. Seeing dung beetles arrive, and then seeing the animals meandering through the project, it felt like living suddenly in the middle of the Serengeti. It felt so incredibly good, a huge relief after what we've been doing to this land for so many decades.
This is a beautiful project. How would you persuade people that it's also a really, really significant project?
Well, I think the two major crises facing the planet are biodiversity loss and climate change. And to some degree, those are also driving all the present conflicts that we have, that are the big distractions on the news and the things that obsess us and distress us. It may seem superficial to be welcoming the bees and the butterflies back, but actually this is a solution to climate change and to biodiversity loss, and that is huge. We know that if we are to preserve the life support systems on this planet on which we as a species depend and every other species depends, we have to find space for nature to 50% of our land and seas, according to E.O. Wilson, 30% if you're thinking about the latest treaty that we've signed. But how do we do that? Well, I think Knepp has shown that, nature will bounce back if you let it. And that is a story of such positivity and ultimately of such hope that we can change the systems. We can bring nature back and provide a place for us on this earth that is truly sustainable.
The key to the ecological success of this rewilding project are the grazing animals who have been reintroduced. Our landscapes were always shaped by grazing animals. For millennia, the ancestors of the wild horses behind me, these are horses from Exmoor, but also ancient bovines. Now they've got longhorn cattle here, and pigs. We used to have wild boar, now we've got Tamworth pigs. I'm going out with the ecologist Matt Phelps to understand more about what these animals are doing for the ecosystem here.
Yeah, so this is one of our 6 Tamworth sows here. She's currently just sort of chomping on the grass and the herbaceous level vegetation on the surface, and that is because the ground here, this Rewilding clay in July as it is now, is really rock solid. It's like concrete, so she's going to be struggling to dig the soil at this time of year. For the other sort of 6-7 months of the year, when the ground is softer, she uses that great big snout to rootle up areas of the ground in which she will find earthworms, plant roots, beetle larvae, that sort of thing. But as I say, at this time of year, she can just sort of resort to grazing, really, just like a cow or any other grazing animal.
These Tamworth pigs are playing the role that wild boars would have played for centuries.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, so we can't legally have wild boar in the UK. They are included in the Dangerous Animals Act from the 1970s. So in their place, the Tamworth pig is a really good proxy. We use this word quite a lot in rewilding, proxy, which means a stand-in, if you like. If your species, if your target herbivore or whatever it might be is extinct, or for legal reasons you can't have it, then you can just have kind of the nearest best thing, basically, and that's what the Tamworths are. This is one of our many footpaths here. We have sort of 15 miles or more of footpaths running through the estate, so we have to consider the fact that, public safety is also very important. Something like a Tamworth pig or a longhorn cow, these are very sort of famously docile breeds, so that's a key consideration. She is actually doing a little bit of the rootling there. She just dug up with her snout a little bit. So she's found a soft patch. We've had a little bit of rain overnight, so she's obviously quite happy about being able to dig and maybe find some worms.
Alongside the Tamworth pig, some rather noble-looking cattle are helping shape the landscape.
So yeah, these are the Old English Longhorns that we have here, the proxy for the aurochs, so the wild European cattle that we would have had a long time ago, roaming across Europe in great herds, like we think of sort of buffalo doing. We had these wild aurochs, as they were known. So they unfortunately don't exist anymore. There are some projects that are trying to sort of backbreed cattle to sort of almost recreate the aurochs. They tend to be, very large and quite temperamental animals. So again, thinking along the lines of the Tamworth pig, the longhorn cow is doing the same thing as an aurochs. It's smaller. It's a bit more compact than an aurochs, but it's functionally very similar. It's got the great big horns, very distinct look with the sort of white finching on the back, as it's called, the stripe down the back. And just like the Tamworth, it is behaving in a very wild way in which it inhabits this landscape. These ones behind us here are grazing on the grasses and other plants in the sward. They will sometimes what's called browse on the sort of more shrubby vegetation, so the blackthorn and the bramble. They are essentially changing this landscape, kind of engineering it through the way they behave. And again, like the pigs, they're dunging, of course. Their dung is very rich in invertebrates, because we use minimal medication here on the animals. So we've got really sort of good, healthy dung for in terms of the soil ecology and all of the invertebrate life as well.
In ancient times, aurochs would have been hunted by wolves or bears, as well as our spear-wielding ancestors, and that controlled their numbers, keeping the ecosystem in balance. In modern England, in the absence of big predators or spear-wielding hunters, the Knepp managers have to step in.
Yeah, we have to be the predator, the human element, one of the sort of management elements here, which is pretty minimal in terms of our management, but it is culling the animals and controlling the numbers. So with the cattle and the pigs, they are taken away for slaughter. All the butchery takes place on site. So we have a butchery here, and then that meat goes into our restaurant and our shop. The deer are actually shot on site. So we have a deer manager, and the deer stalking takes place on site. So those animals never need to leave Knepp. But it's all part of the wider conversation, of course, is actually sustainable meat production and, really kind of organic animals living in this wild setting, which then also actually do produce meat. So it's a nice part of the story to be able to tell that, yeah, as you say, we're mimicking the predators, which we don't have, but actually it's bringing the whole thing full cycle in terms of it's helping to fund the estate, fund the project.
Of course, we eat far too much red meat in the West, and that has a hugely destructive impact on the planet. But because grazers can help biodiversity and even carbon storage in the soil, extensive beef farming producing small amounts of meat can be beneficial.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people now thinking about, how much meat they're consuming, where it's coming from, and I think the sort of discomfort around eating meat increasingly is related to that kind of intensive production, what we think of as, the clearing of swathes of the Amazon to grow food, which then feeds obviously the cattle to make beef. That is obviously not what's taking place here. What we have here is a relatively small amount of meat each year, sort of 75 tonnes of live weight we produce here, but it is really good quality. It is actually, the animals here are actually contributing to the landscape improvement. So it's really the absolute opposite of intensive beef farming. These animals are, they're integral to what's happening here at Knepp. So actually, by eating the meat, you're almost sort of, you're not almost, you are actually sort of helping fund this and support this project.
For the last 10 years, the public has been able to visit this project. And that's really important, I think, because people come here and they're inspired by the return of nature, what is possible. And at a time when people are feeling very dejected, when there's eco-anxiety flourishing, it seems really important to inspire people that things could be different, could be better.
Well, I can't remember who said it, but someone said that hope is a moral obligation. And I think, you have to feel hope because otherwise you do nothing. But when you have a project like this where it's so easy to tell the story of hope, it really does change you. It empowers you and gives you that sort of galvanizing sense that things can happen, and they can happen fast. That's what's so amazing. This has all happened within 25 years, which is a blink of an eye. So that is where I think the source of hope comes from. I think to be an environmental activist, you have to have hope and anger in equal measure, because I think we still need to feel angry that the tide hasn't turned so as fast as we would like it, that there are still, massive vested interests out there trying to preserve the status quo and prevent change. And so that is where we need to place our anger. But where we need to see hope and to feel that energy and that encouragement is in nature itself and how it wants to bounce back. And we must just let it do that.
And this is £50,000 worth of fencing.
One of the aspects that gives me hope is the reintroduction of beavers and how these beavers help climate resilience. Matt has taken me inside the beaver pen at Knepp.
Basically everything you're seeing has been done by the beavers. So all the felling of trees, of course, beavers are famous for that, but most importantly the creation of the water. They're felling the trees to dam the water, slow it down, create more pools, which is where they live, and in the process you get more dead wood, you get more light coming in, you've got more diverse flow of water, and just simply more water being held back on the land. So this is why we celebrate these animals, basically. They're incredible.
My project is called Nature for People.
Yeah.
Why is helping the beavers, giving them a habitat to do their thing in, why is that good for us?
Yeah, I mean, great question. We have this term ecosystem services, which is kind of quite a clunky way of saying the way in which nature benefits us. So the things that the natural world, when it is healthy and functioning, does that benefits humans. So that is things like, for example, beavers will help filter water. So it's proven that downstream of where beavers are active and damming a watercourse, the water comes through cleaner the other side. Basically, it's being filtered as it goes through the dams. You've also got less flash flooding. So where the water's being held back by the dams, each time that happens, it's slowing that flow of water. So you just do not get the massive flooding events as much as you would without the beaver dams. And then conversely, here we've just had one of the driest springs and summers for decades in the south of England, and yet there's still standing water here. In a lot of this enclosure, and even outside the enclosure where it's spilling out, you've got very wet ground. So of course, from the perspective of plants growing, farmers, there are farmers where there are beavers in the West Country in England who are actually benefiting from the fact that their land is simply wetter at the driest time of year. So there's all of these things they're bringing about, and quite simply just that wonder of being in a sort of beaver landscape. People get really excited when they come in here. You sort of sense that change of you've gone into some really special, different landscape because something is here that is not currently in the wider landscape of Sussex.
Hang on, Matt. In the news, we've got droughts causing terrible economic and social damage, floods causing great human pain, economic damage. If beavers can counteract that, why have we fenced them in? And why aren't we giving them romantic music saying make some more families and get out there?
Great, yeah, absolutely. It's a totally valid point. We've been stuck in a kind of a legislative limbo for quite a long time. Beavers were only given sort of proper protected native status again in England about 3 years ago. It's just really slow. All of these things, particularly I think in the UK, we're an island, of course, off the coast of mainland Europe. It just seems to be everything takes a very long time. We're very cautious, we're very conservative. Things that are absent, there's a sort of tendency to think, oh, well, they must be gone for a reason. Why are we wanting to bring them back? Better the devil I suppose. A lot of people think, look, we'll just manage, we'll cope with how things are. When we start bringing in a wild animal that wasn't here for hundreds of years, there's all of this sort of anxiety around, but it might cause lots of problems. But you're absolutely right, is that the net benefit of having beavers, everything they do here that we've seen at Knepp and in every other part of Europe where there are beavers, they are bringing about these amazing changes. And yeah, I think we're spending something like 2 billion on flood mitigation in Britain now a year. Beavers will help. They are a crucial ally.
Knepp's landscape is changing year by year. It's an open-air laboratory to see what happens when intensive farming is abandoned and once again nature begins to shape our countryside.
Yeah, basically this is the sort of what we describe as the most savanna landscape of Northern Europe, as once was. This idea that sort of this part of the world used to be closed canopy woodland and the squirrels could run from Cornwall to Scotland without touching the ground is now largely kind of thought to be not the case. You know, this open field structure with sort of patches of bramble, patches of scrub and young trees popping through is thought to be now more of a sort of typical Northern European landscape. What we've got here is you can still see the sort of field shape, the field boundary, this hedgerow along the edge. That's not, of course, natural in the strictest sense because those trees haven't chosen to grow in a straight line. So it's a sort of reminder to us of, 25, 30 years ago, this would have been an arable field, as amazing as that sounds. And actually the way in which the field was last farmed has to some extent dictated what it's become. So when it was last harvested, let's say it might have been 2006 or 2001, that sort of 5-year difference can actually make quite a big difference in terms of how it looks now, because certain plants will have sort of got hold more readily. The animals that are moving through it, what are they choosing to eat? Where are they choosing to spend their time? That's something we're looking at as well, is are they spending more time in certain areas, thereby they're kind of keeping it more open as a result.
The needs of the grazing animals compete with the needs of the vegetation. It's a dynamic ecological battle zone.
Yeah, it's a kind of tug of war, I suppose, the best way to think of it. One of the presentations we do here, one of my colleagues has a great sort of very simple diagram of 2 arrows, and it's simply the arrow of vegetation pushing against the arrow of herbivores, of roaming animals that are trying to push back. They're just eating away at this stuff. This is sort of strange shapes of the bushes around us here. That is because they'll browse a little bit and then they'll move somewhere else, and they're constantly taking little sort of chunks out of the vegetation. But that is very variable across the landscape. And of course, if you'd imagined, Knepp is just a pocket of rewilded landscape. If you imagine when this was the whole of the sort of European landmass, animals would have moved in massive herds of sort of thousands of animals together at once, and they would have settled in an area and maybe kind of stripped it kind of pretty bare, and then they would have moved on, and then that bit of land would have recovered and another area would have been browsed and grazed quite heavily. So this is, I suppose, just a kind of little microcosm of that in a relatively small area, of how they impact the landscape in different parts of the estate.
When the project began, there were hopes and expectations, but no one really knew for sure what would happen.
I think there's a lot of surprises, actually. I think the beauty of what's happened here is it's a very sort of standoff approach. So we're as much as possible, we're looking at what happens and then kind of thinking, that's interesting. What does that mean? Or how do we interpret that? And how do we, change things slightly? Do we need to do things differently? Have we got all the animals that we want here? Are there things missing? But there's a huge amount of surprises. I suppose most of all in the species that have come back and flourished here. They're not necessarily, I suppose, if you'd drawn up a list in the year 2000, of what might come back in this sort of landscape, you might not have predicted that we would have, a quarter of the turtle doves in Sussex and 1% of the British population of nightingales and biggest population of purple emperors in the country. These are things that have kind of surprised us. So yeah, I mean, we are learning all the time. That's the beauty of this project.